I never thought I'd become invisible in my own son's house. At 62, I figured I'd earned some respect, maybe even a little gratitude. Instead, I found myself hiding behind the kitchen door, listening to my daughter-in-law Victoria destroy what was left of my dignity. "She's a parasite we can't shake off," Victoria whispered to her circle of perfectly manicured friends, her voice dripping with the kind of venom that only comes from years of practiced cruelty. They were gathered in my son James's living room, sipping wine from glasses I'd given them as a wedding gift 7 years ago. My hands trembled as I gripped the doorframe, fighting the urge to march in there and defend myself. But what would I say? That I wasn't a burden? That I contributed more to this family than she could ever imagine? The words would sound pathetic, desperate. "I mean, honestly," Victoria continued, her laugh sharp and cutting, "she follows James around like a lost puppy. Every family dinner, every holiday, there she is with that sad, grateful smile."
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
It's exhausting. One of her friends, a blonde woman whose name I could never remember, leaned forward conspiratorially. "Can't James just set some boundaries?" "Oh, trust me, I've tried," Victoria sighed dramatically. "But you know how men are with their mothers. He feels guilty because she's alone, because his father died 3 years ago. I keep telling him that grief isn't an excuse to monopolize our lives." The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I pressed my back against the cool wall, trying to steady my breathing. 3 years since Richard passed, and not once had Victoria shown an ounce of compassion for my loss. If anything, she seemed to see his death as an opportunity to finally push me out of James's life completely. "What about putting her in one of those senior communities?" another voice suggested. "My mother-in-law loves hers, keeps her busy, gives her friends her own age." Victoria's voice brightened with false enthusiasm. "That's exactly what I keep suggesting. There's this lovely place about an hour away, far enough to give us some space, but close enough that James won't feel guilty about visiting once a month." Once a month. My throat tightened. Was that really how little my presence meant to them? "The thing is," Victoria lowered her voice, and I had to strain to hear her next words, "she has this way of making everything about her. Like when James got sick in college, she acted like she was the only one who cared, the only one who suffered. It was all very dramatic." My blood ran cold. James getting sick in college. She was talking about his leukemia, about those 14 months that nearly destroyed our family. Those 14 months when I slept in hospital chairs and held my son's hand through chemotherapy sessions, when I researched every treatment option, fought with insurance companies, and never once left his side. Victoria had been nowhere during that time. She didn't even know James then. "I just think some people enjoy being martyrs," Victoria continued. "They need to feel needed, you know? It's actually quite selfish when you think about it." The cruelty of it took my breath away. I closed my eyes, remembering the weight of responsibility I'd carried during James's illness. The sleepless nights, the fear that consumed every waking moment, the way I'd aged a decade in those 14 months. "Well," came a voice I didn't recognize, softer than the others. At least she was there when it mattered. The room went quiet. I opened my eyes, suddenly alert. "What do you mean?" Victoria's voice had changed, become sharper, more defensive. "I just mean, when someone's child is fighting cancer, having family support makes all the difference. I went through something similar with my nephew. The doctors always say that having dedicated caregivers can be crucial to recovery." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, well," Victoria said finally, her tone dismissive, "anyone would have done the same thing. It's not like she had a choice." But there was something different in her voice now, a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "Still," the same voice continued gently, "I've heard that family members sometimes go to extraordinary lengths. Blood drives, bone marrow testing, things like that. It's really quite remarkable what parents will do." Then someone muttered, just loud enough for me to catch it, "She's the one who kept your husband alive." The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, waiting for Victoria's response, but when it came, it was nothing more than a nervous laugh that died almost immediately. "I think we should probably start dinner," Victoria said abruptly. "James will be home soon." The conversation shifted to safer topics, vacation plans, children's schools, the weather. But I remained frozen behind that kitchen door, those whispered words echoing in my mind. "She's the one who kept your husband alive." Someone in that room knew. Someone understood what I'd really done during those dark months 15 years ago. Someone knew about the secret I'd carried all these years, the secret that could change everything between James and me. As I finally forced myself to move, to pretend I'd been busy in the kitchen all along, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully guarded truth was about to surface. And when it did, Victoria's cruel words would come back to haunt her in ways she never imagined. The sound of James's key in the front door made my heart race. Soon, very soon, everything was going to change. Chapter 2. The Weight of Memory. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of the guest room that had become my permanent residence in what used to be my family home. The walls seemed to close in around me as Victoria's words replayed in my mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Parasite. Dramatic. Selfish. But it was that whispered comment from the unknown woman that haunted me most. She's the one who kept your husband alive. How could anyone know? I'd been so careful, so deliberate about keeping that part of James's story private. The doctors had respected my wishes for anonymity. The hospital staff had maintained their professional discretion. Even James himself didn't know the full truth of what had happened during those terrifying months when he was 17. I rolled over and pulled Richard's old pillow closer to my chest, inhaling the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered after 3 years. He would have known what to do. Richard always knew how to handle difficult situations with grace and wisdom. But Richard was gone, and I was left to navigate this minefield alone. The memories came flooding back whether I wanted them or not. It was October 2008 when James first complained of feeling tired all the time. He was a junior in high school, captain of the soccer team, honor roll student with dreams of studying engineering. I thought it was just teenage growth spurts and too many late nights studying. Then came the bruises that wouldn't heal, the nosebleeds that seemed to come from nowhere, the way his skin took on a grayish pallor that no amount of sleep could cure, the pediatrician's concerned frown during what should have been a routine checkup, the blood tests that came back with numbers that made nurses speak in hushed tones. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Dr. Rodriguez had delivered the diagnosis with the kind of gentle firmness that comes from years of breaking parents' hearts. It's aggressive, but treatable. We'll need to start chemotherapy immediately. The world had stopped spinning in that moment. James, my beautiful boy who just weeks before had been planning his senior year and filling out college applications, suddenly faced a battle for his very existence. Richard and I had held each other in the hospital parking lot and cried until we had no tears left. Those first few weeks were a blur of medical terminology and treatment schedules. Induction therapy, they called it. High-dose chemotherapy designed to kill the cancer cells while hopefully sparing enough healthy tissue to keep James alive. The side effects were brutal. Nausea so severe he couldn't keep water down, mouth sores that made eating agony, hair that fell out in clumps on his pillow. I moved into the hospital. Not officially, of course, but I spent every night in that uncomfortable reclining chair beside James's bed, dozed fitfully between nurse visits, and learned the rhythm of the oncology ward, the hushed conversations at the nurse's station, the way different alarms meant different levels of urgency, the sound of parents crying behind closed doors. Richard tried to maintain normalcy, going to work during the day to keep our insurance coverage intact, managing the household, dealing with the mountains of paperwork that serious illness generates. But I couldn't leave. Every time I tried to go home for a shower or a real meal, something would happen. James's fever would spike, or his blood pressure would drop, or he'd wake up frightened and disoriented from the medications. Victoria had no idea about any of this. She didn't know about the night James's temperature hit 104, and I spent 6 hours applying ice packs while we waited for the fever to break. She'd never heard about the time his white blood cell count dropped so low that a simple cold could have killed him, so he was isolated for 3 weeks with only Richard and me allowed to visit, and only after scrubbing in like surgeons. She certainly didn't know about the morning I found James crying in his hospital bed. Not from pain, but from despair. He was 17 years old, watching his friends plan prom and graduation while he fought for his life. "Mom," he'd whispered, "what if I die without ever really living?" I'd climbed into that narrow hospital bed and held my son while he sobbed, promising him that he would live, that he would graduate, that he would go to college and fall in love and have children of his own. I made promises I had no right to make, but I would have said anything to give him hope. The initial treatment protocol lasted 6 months. 6 months of chemotherapy cycles that would knock James down just when he seemed to be getting stronger. His hair grew back in patches, fell out again, grew back thinner. He lost 30 pounds from his already lean frame. His skin took on a translucent quality that made him look fragile as paper. But slowly, gradually, the treatment seemed to be working. His blast counts, the measure of cancer cells in his bloodstream, began dropping. The bruises stopped appearing. His energy started to return in small increments. We dared to hope. Then came the appointment that shattered our fragile optimism. Dr. Rodriguez's office, with its beige walls and carefully neutral artwork. The way he shuffled through James's test results before looking up at us with an expression I'd learned to dread. The current treatment isn't achieving the results we need, he said carefully. James's blast count has plateaued at a level that's too high for us to consider him in remission. We need to discuss more aggressive options. What kind of options? Richard asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already suspected. Bone marrow transplant. At this point, it's our best option for achieving long-term remission. Without it, the cancer will almost certainly return. The testing began immediately. Richard went first, hopeful that as James's father, he might be a suitable match. The initial blood work looked promising, but the more detailed genetic testing revealed incompatibilities that ruled him out as a donor. I was tested next, along with James's younger cousin Danny and his paternal grandfather. One by one, the results came back negative. Not close enough matches, not viable options. I remembered sitting in that sterile waiting room, watching other families come and go, some with hope in their eyes, others with the hollow look of defeat. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that felt obscene in the face of so much suffering. Mrs. Henderson, a nurse I didn't recognize, had approached me during one of my vigils. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "I'm Sarah from the Bone Marrow Registry. Could I speak with you privately?" We'd walked to a small consultation room where she explained that sometimes, when traditional family matches weren't available, they could search the National Registry for unrelated donors. But the process could take months, identifying potential donors, conducting preliminary matching, arranging more detailed testing, and then hoping the selected donor would actually follow through with the procedure. "The reality is," Sarah had said gently, "finding an unrelated donor can take 6 months to a year, sometimes longer, and that's assuming we find a suitable match at all." James didn't have 6 months to a year. The doctors had been clear about that. "There is one other option," she'd continued carefully. "Sometimes we find that extended testing of family members reveals compatibility that doesn't show up in initial screenings. Different markers, more specific matching protocols. The science has advanced significantly in recent years. Would you be willing to undergo more comprehensive testing?" I'd agreed immediately, though I didn't hold much hope. The initial tests had been so definitive, so disappointing. 3 days later, Sarah had called with results that changed everything. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to come in as soon as possible. Dr. Rodriguez wants to discuss your test results in person." The drive to the hospital had been the longest 20 minutes of my life. I'd tried to prepare myself for more disappointment, for the confirmation that James would need to go on the National Registry and pray for a miracle. Instead, Dr. Rodriguez had delivered news that seemed too good to be true. "Not only are you a compatible donor," he'd said, looking at my test results with something approaching amazement, "you're what we call a perfect match. Your tissue compatibility markers align with James's on every major histocompatibility complex we test for. This level of matching is extraordinary, even between parent and child." The relief had been overwhelming. James had a donor. He had a chance. But there was more to the story. Complications that Dr. Rodriguez explained with careful medical precision. "Your blood work has revealed some irregularities that we need to address," he'd said. "Nothing dangerous to your long-term health, but significant enough that the donation procedure will require special protocols. Your platelet count is lower than ideal, and your recovery time will likely be longer than typical." The procedure itself carried risks, he explained. At 47, I was older than the preferred donor age range. The bone marrow extraction would require general anesthesia and surgery, with potential complications including excessive bleeding, infection, and nerve damage. In rare cases, Dr. Rodriguez had said, donors experience long-term effects, chronic fatigue, increased susceptibility to infections, changes in their own blood chemistry. We can't predict who might experience these complications. Richard had been torn between relief that a match had been found and terror that he might lose both his wife and son. "I need to do this," I told him that night as we sat in our kitchen, the same kitchen where Victoria now held court with her friends. "He's our son. He needs this chance." But I'd made one request that surprised everyone involved in James's care. I wanted to remain anonymous as his donor, even to James himself. "He's been through so much already," I'd explained to Dr. Rodriguez. "So much guilt about what this illness is doing to our family, so much fear about the future. If he knows I'm his donor, he'll carry the additional burden of feeling like he owes me his life. I want him to recover, knowing that he fought this battle and won, not that his mother had to save him. Dr. Rodriguez had been reluctant initially. Family transparency was typically encouraged in transplant situations, but he'd eventually agreed to maintain the anonymity, listing me in James's records simply as a compatible family member who wished to remain unidentified. The donation procedure had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March 2009. I remembered everything about that day with crystal clarity. The early morning arrival at the hospital, the pre-surgical preparations, the anesthesiologist's reassuring voice as I counted backward from 10. What should have been a routine procedure turned into something far more complicated. The bone marrow extraction, normally completed in 2 to 3 hours, stretched into a 6-hour ordeal when complications arose during the surgery. I'd awakened in the recovery room to find Richard holding my hand, his face pale with worry. Dr. Rodriguez stood at the foot of my bed, reviewing charts with a frown. There were some unexpected difficulties during the procedure, he explained once I was fully conscious. Your bone marrow was denser than typical, which made the extraction more challenging. We had to take multiple samples from different sites to get the volume we needed for James. The result was significant blood loss, more than they'd anticipated. I'd required a transfusion and spent 4 days in intensive care while my body struggled to recover. The incision sites became infected, requiring additional surgery and a prolonged course of antibiotics. But it had worked. Within days of receiving my bone marrow, James began showing signs of improvement. His body accepted the transplant without rejection, and slowly, carefully, his blood counts began returning to normal ranges. The next 6 months were still difficult. James remained vulnerable to infections while his new immune system developed. He had to be isolated from crowds, couldn't return to school immediately, and needed constant monitoring for signs of complications. But month by month, his strength returned. His hair grew back thicker and darker than before. His smile, which had become so rare during those dark months, began to reappear. The pallor faded from his skin, replaced by healthy color. My own recovery was slower and more complicated than anyone had expected. The infection at the surgical sites required 3 additional procedures to fully resolve. I developed chronic fatigue that lasted nearly a year, and my immune system never quite returned to its pre-donation strength. Even now, 15 years later, I was more susceptible to colds and infections than I'd been before the transplant. My annual blood work still showed subtle changes from the donation. Minor consequences, but permanent ones. I'd never regretted the decision to remain anonymous. Watching James live his life free from the weight of knowing what I'd sacrificed had been worth every moment of pain, every day of recovery, every long-term consequence I'd endured. He'd graduated from high school on time, gone to college, earned his engineering degree, and built a successful career. He'd met Victoria, fallen in love, and married her in a beautiful ceremony where he'd danced with me to "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song Richard and I had chosen for our wedding. Through it all, James had remained grateful for his recovery, but never burdened by the knowledge of exactly what it had cost. To him, his bone marrow donor was an anonymous hero, someone he thought about with gratitude but no personal obligation. But now, lying in this guest room while his wife called me a parasite in the next room, I wondered if my sacrifice had been meaningless. James couldn't defend what he didn't know about. Victoria felt free to dismiss my place in their lives because she had no idea what I'd endured for their happiness. And somewhere in that living room tonight, someone had known the truth. Someone had seen through the carefully maintained facade and recognized what I'd really done for my son. The question that kept me awake until dawn was simple but profound. After 15 years of silence, was it time to tell James the truth about who had saved his life? The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Victoria had left early for her weekly yoga class, and James was at work, leaving me alone in the house for the first time in weeks. The silence felt different now, not oppressive, but charged with possibility. I made myself coffee in the kitchen that had once been mine, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. Every creak and whisper held memories. James's first steps across these floors, Christmas mornings filled with laughter, quiet conversations with Richard at this very table while we planned our future. Now those memories felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I was reaching for my medication when I noticed the basement door standing slightly ajar. Victoria must have forgotten to close it after retrieving something from storage. The basement, that's where my life had been relegated when they decided the guest room needed to become Victoria's home office. Most of my belongings had been moved down there 6 months ago, boxes labeled with Victoria's efficient handwriting. Margaret's books, Margaret's photos, Margaret's personal items, as if I were already dead and they were simply cataloging the remains. But there was something down there I'd almost forgotten about. Something that could change everything. I descended the narrow wooden stairs, my hand trailing along the banister Richard had installed himself 25 years ago. The basement still smelled faintly of his woodworking hobby, cedar shavings and varnish that had soaked into the concrete walls over decades of weekend projects. My boxes were stacked neatly in one corner, a monument to a life being gradually erased, but I wasn't looking for those. Instead, I made my way to Richard's old filing cabinets, the gray metal monsters he'd used to organize every important document from our 40-year marriage. Richard had been meticulous about record-keeping, a trait that had often frustrated me during our early years together, but had proved invaluable over time. He'd saved everything: tax returns, insurance policies, medical records, even receipts for major purchases going back decades. The medical files were in the bottom drawer, organized chronologically in manila folders labeled in Richard's careful handwriting. I found what I was looking for in a thick folder marked James Medical, 2008-2009. My hands trembled as I opened it, releasing the musty smell of old paper and forgotten years. Inside were photocopies of everything: initial blood test results showing James's alarming cell counts, the oncology consultation notes, chemotherapy protocols, and hospital bills that had stretched our insurance to its limits. But buried near the bottom of the folder was what I really needed: the bone marrow transplant documentation. Richard had copied everything, bless him. Pre-transplant testing results for the entire family, donor compatibility reports, surgical consent forms, post-procedure follow-up notes, and there, in Dr. Rodriguez's precise medical handwriting, was my name listed as the donor on every document. I spread the papers across Richard's old workbench, my heart racing as I read through details I'd tried to forget. The surgical report was particularly sobering, describing in clinical terms the complications that had turned my routine donation into a 6-hour ordeal. Donor experienced significant bleeding during marrow extraction due to unusually dense bone structure. Multiple aspiration sites required. Estimated blood loss 800 milliliters, requiring transfusion. Post-operative complications included surgical site infection and delayed healing. 800 milliliters. Nearly 2 pints of blood, in addition to the bone marrow itself. No wonder I'd felt weak for months afterward. There were follow-up notes, too, documenting my prolonged recovery, the additional surgeries needed to treat the infections, the way my immune system had been compromised by the procedure. Dr. Rodriguez had been concerned enough to schedule monthly checkups for an entire year after the transplant. But most importantly, there was correspondence between Dr. Rodriguez and the hospital administration regarding my request for anonymity. A letter from the hospital's ethics committee approving the unusual arrangement. Documentation showing that my identity as James's donor had been sealed in his medical records, accessible only to the primary medical team. 15 years of proof that I had saved my son's life, and he had never known. I carefully photographed each document with my phone, my hands steadier now that I had a purpose. These weren't just medical records. They were evidence of a truth that could change everything between James and me, between all of us. As I worked, my mind wandered to that mysterious comment from last night. "She's the one who kept your husband alive." Who had said it? The voice had been unfamiliar, but there had been something in the tone, a certainty that suggested more than casual knowledge. I thought about the women who'd been in Victoria's circle last night. Most were her yoga friends, mothers from the private school where Victoria served on various committees, wives of James's colleagues. But there had been one woman I didn't recognize, older than the others, with silver hair and kind eyes who had seemed somewhat out of place among Victoria's usual crowd. Could she have been a nurse from the hospital? Someone who remembered me from those long months when I'd practically lived in the oncology ward? It was possible. The nursing staff on that floor had come to know me well, had often commented on my dedication to James's care. The thought that someone from that time might have recognized me, might remember what I'd done, sent a shiver of both fear and anticipation through me. For 15 years I'd kept this secret locked away, protecting James from the burden of knowing. But now, with Victoria's cruelty becoming more brazen by the day, I wondered if my silence had been a mistake. I returned the medical files to their folder, but not before making one more discovery that stopped me cold. At the very bottom of the stack was a letter I'd never seen before, written in Richard's handwriting and dated just 3 months before his death. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably going through these old files, trying to make sense of everything we've accumulated over the years. There's something I need you to know, Something I should have said while I was still alive to say it properly. I've watched you carry the weight of what you did for James in silence for all these years. I've seen how it pained you sometimes. Watching him live his life without knowing what you sacrificed for him. I respected your decision to remain anonymous, even when I disagreed with it. But Margaret, my love, you need to know that your sacrifice didn't go unnoticed by everyone. I kept copies of everything because I knew that someday you might need proof of what you did. Not for James necessarily, but for yourself. For those times when you doubt your worth, when you feel invisible or unappreciated. You saved our son's life. You literally gave him a future he wouldn't have had without you. And if anyone, ever, makes you feel like you don't matter, like you're a burden or an inconvenience, I want you to remember that truth. You are a hero, Margaret. You always have been. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. All my love, always, Richard. Tears blurred my vision as I read Richard's words, his voice so clear in my mind that I could almost hear him speaking. He'd known. He'd understood the burden I'd been carrying all these years, the weight of an heroic act that could never be acknowledged. But more than that, he'd given me permission to use this truth if I ever needed to. He'd preserved the evidence and left me instructions, knowing that someday I might find myself in exactly this situation. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my pocket, along with several of the most important medical documents. The rest I returned to their folder, but now I carried with me the proof of what I'd done, and my husband's blessing to use it. Upstairs, I could hear the front door opening. Victoria's voice drifted through the house, high and animated as she spoke on her phone. No, she was here when I left, probably skulking around somewhere, looking for things to complain about. The casual cruelty of it would have devastated me yesterday. Today, it simply strengthened my resolve. I climbed the basement stairs slowly, my mind already working through the possibilities. I could confront Victoria directly, show her the medical records and demand the respect I'd earned. I could tell James everything, finally reveal the truth he'd never known about his recovery. Or I could wait, be strategic about this revelation. After all, someone in that room last night had already planted the seed of doubt in Victoria's mind. Someone knew the truth and had been bold enough to hint at it in front of the very person who'd been dismissing my value. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard Victoria ending her phone call in the kitchen. I know, she was saying. But what can I do? James won't hear a word against her. You'd think she was some kind of saint the way he talks about her. A saint. If only she knew how close to the truth that really was. I closed the basement door quietly and made my way to my room, Richard's letter burning like a talisman in my pocket. For the first time in years, I felt like I held real power in my hands. The question was, what was I going to do with it? Victoria's laughter echoed from the kitchen, but it sounded different to me now. Hollow, almost desperate, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she had to be wondering about that comment from last night. She's the one who kept your husband alive. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now I just had to decide how carefully to tend it, and when to let it bloom into the full, devastating truth. James would be home in a few hours. Tonight, over dinner, I would study his face as I'd done countless times before, looking for traces of the frightened 17-year-old boy who'd cried in my arms and asked if he would die without ever really living. He'd lived. He'd lived because of me. And soon, very soon, he was going to know it. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. 3 days after finding Richard's documents, James announced that Dr. Rodriguez would be retiring next month, and the hospital was hosting a farewell reception in his honor. I thought we might go, James said over breakfast, stirring sugar into his coffee with the same methodical precision he'd shown as a child. Dr. Rodriguez was such an important part of my recovery. I'd like to thank him one more time. Victoria looked up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling through social media with the dedication of someone avoiding real conversation. Do we have to? Hospital parties are so depressing. All those medical people talking about diseases and death. The dismissiveness in her voice made my jaw clench. Dr. Rodriguez had saved our son's life, had guided us through the darkest period our family had ever faced, and she couldn't be bothered to spend 2 hours honoring him. I think it's a wonderful idea, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Dr. Rodriguez deserves our gratitude. James smiled at me across the table, the same warm expression that had melted my heart when he was 5 years old and missing his front teeth. Great. It's next Friday at 7. The whole oncology team will be there, plus former patients and their families. Former patients and their families. My pulse quickened as I realized what this meant. All those people who'd been part of James's journey 15 years ago would be gathering in one place. including, quite possibly, the nursing staff who'd watched me keep vigil during those endless months, including Sarah from the bone marrow registry, who'd been the one to tell me about the extended compatibility testing. "I'll need to get something appropriate to wear," Victoria said, already planning her outfit for maximum impact. "Something that says supportive but not too involved. I don't want people thinking I'm some kind of medical groupie." If only she knew that I was the one people would remember. Not for my outfit, but for sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs, for learning to read medical monitors, for being there when it mattered most. That afternoon, while Victoria was at her book club, I made a phone call I'd been considering since finding the documents. St. Mary's Hospital Oncology Department. "Hello, this is Margaret Henderson. I was wondering if Sarah Willis still works in your bone marrow registry." "Sarah Willis? Yes. She's our senior coordinator now. Would you like me to transfer you?" My heart raced. "Actually, I'll be seeing her at Dr. Rodriguez's retirement party. Thank you." So Sarah was still there, still working with families navigating the same terrifying journey we'd faced 15 years ago. If anyone would remember me, remember what I'd done, it would be her. The next few days passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Victoria continued her casual cruelties, making comments about my limited wardrobe and suggesting I might be too emotional for such an event. But her words had lost their power to wound me. Every cruel remark just reinforced my growing conviction that it was time for the truth to surface. I spent hours planning what I would say if the opportunity arose. How do you casually mention that you saved someone's life? How do you reveal a secret you've kept for 15 years without sounding manipulative or attention-seeking? The answer, I realized, was that you don't. You let the truth reveal itself naturally, and you trust that the people who matter will recognize it for what it is. Friday evening arrived gray and humid, typical September weather that made my carefully chosen navy dress cling uncomfortably to my skin. I'd selected it specifically because it was the same color I'd worn to James's high school graduation, the ceremony we'd thought might never happen during those dark months of his illness. Victoria emerged from her room looking stunning, as always, in a sleek black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She'd styled her blonde hair in an elegant updo and applied makeup with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was everything. "You look nice, Mom," James said as we gathered in the foyer, and I could hear genuine affection in his voice. For a moment, I saw past the man he'd become to the grateful teenager who'd hugged me tightly the day he'd been declared cancer-free. The hospital had been remodeled since James's treatment, all gleaming surfaces and modern artwork designed to make people forget they were in a place where life and death decisions were made daily. But the oncology floor remained familiar, and as we stepped off the elevator, 15 years seemed to collapse into nothing. The reception was held in a conference room that had been transformed with white tablecloths, fresh flowers, and a small podium where speakers would honor Dr. Rodriguez's 40-year career. The guest list was exactly what I'd hoped for, a mixture of current staff, former colleagues, and families whose lives had been touched by his expertise. I spotted Sarah immediately. Her hair was completely silver now, and she wore reading glasses that hadn't been there 15 years ago, but her kind eyes were unchanged. She was standing near the refreshment table, speaking with a group of nurses I recognized from the old days. "Margaret Henderson?" I turned to find Dr. Rodriguez himself approaching, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. He was older, more fragile than I remembered, but his smile was as warm as ever. "Dr. Rodriguez," I said, accepting his embrace. "Congratulations on your retirement. Thank you for coming," he said, then turned to James. "And look at you, married, successful, healthy. You're one of my greatest success stories." James beamed with the pride of someone who'd beaten impossible odds. "I owe everything to you, Dr. Rodriguez. The treatment you designed, the way you never gave up on me." Dr. Rodriguez's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, James, your recovery was truly remarkable, but it wasn't just the medical treatment that made the difference. You had extraordinary family support. Not every patient is so fortunate." Victoria stepped closer, clearly expecting to be included in this praise. "We all did our best to help," she said, her voice taking on the modest tone she used when fishing for compliments. Dr. Rodriguez looked confused for a moment, then his gaze shifted to me. "Margaret, I was just thinking about how dedicated you were during James's treatment. I don't think I've ever seen a mother more committed to her child's recovery. Any mother would have done the same," I said quietly, echoing Victoria's words from earlier in the week. "No," Dr. Rodriguez said firmly, "not every mother could have done what you did. The sacrifice you made went far beyond normal parental dedication." James looked between us, puzzled, What do you mean? Before Dr. Rodriguez could answer, Victoria jumped in with a nervous laugh. I'm sure Margaret was very supportive, but let's not make it sound more dramatic than it was. She sat with James during treatments. That's what mothers do. Dr. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see him processing Victoria's dismissive tone. His gaze returned to me, and something passed between us, a understanding, a recognition that the truth was more complex than it appeared. Of course, he said carefully. Family support takes many forms. But I could see him making mental calculations, remembering details from 15 years ago. Victoria's age, her obvious unfamiliarity with the specifics of James's treatment, the way she'd spoken as if she'd been there when she clearly hadn't been. Excuse me, came a voice behind us. Margaret? Margaret Henderson? I turned to find Sarah approaching, her face bright with recognition and something that looked like excitement. Sarah? I said, my heart pounding. How wonderful to see you. I couldn't believe it when I saw you from across the room, Sarah said, her voice warm with genuine affection. You look exactly the same. How are you? How's your health? Any lingering effects from the procedure? The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Victoria's face went pale, and James looked completely bewildered. Procedure? James asked slowly. Sarah looked around at our small group, suddenly realizing she'd said something significant. Her eyes widened as she took in Victoria's shocked expression and James's confusion. Oh, she said softly. Oh my. I just assumed. After all these years, I thought surely. Dr. Rodriguez cleared his throat gently. Sarah, perhaps we should— What procedure? James asked again, his voice stronger now, more insistent. I looked at my son, this man I'd given life to twice, and made a decision that had been 15 years in the making. The bone marrow transplant, I said quietly. The procedure where I donated bone marrow to save your life. The silence that followed was complete. Around us, the party continued, but our little circle had become frozen in time. James stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, while Victoria looked like she might faint. You were my donor? James whispered. She was more than that, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret, you probably don't remember, but I was the one who coordinated your testing, who called you with the results. I've been doing this work for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what you went through for James. Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly. The surgery was complicated. Margaret was in intensive care for 4 days. The recovery took months. James reached for a nearby chair, his legs seeming suddenly unsteady. You were my anonymous donor. All these years, I thought. I never knew it was you. I asked them not to tell you, I said gently. I wanted you to focus on getting better, not on feeling obligated to me. Victoria's voice, when it came, was barely audible. You donated bone marrow? She saved his life, Sarah said firmly, looking directly at Victoria. Without Margaret's donation, James wouldn't have survived. It's that simple. The weight of truth settled over our group like a blanket. James continued staring at me with wonder, and something that looked like grief. Perhaps for all the gratitude he'd never been able to express, all the acknowledgement I'd never received. But it was Victoria's expression that held my attention. The woman who'd called me a parasite just days ago was confronting the reality that I had literally given her husband life itself. I need some air, she said suddenly, and fled toward the exit. James started to follow her, then stopped and turned back to me. When he spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. Mom? Why didn't you tell me? Because, I said, reaching for his hand. You don't owe me your life, James. I gave it freely, the way any mother would. I just wanted you to live. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally free to be seen for who I really was. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of Victoria's occasional sniffles from the back seat. James gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw working as he processed everything he'd learned. I sat in the passenger seat, feeling strangely empty after carrying the weight of that secret for so long. When we reached the house, Victoria disappeared immediately into their bedroom, the door slamming with enough force to rattle the picture frames in the hallway. James and I stood in the foyer, looking at each other like strangers trying to figure out where to begin. Coffee? He asked finally, his voice hoarse. I nodded, following him into the kitchen where this whole ordeal had begun just days ago, when I'd overheard Victoria's cruel words. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were about to have the most important conversation of our relationship in the same space where she'd called me a parasite. James moved through the familiar motions of making coffee, but his hands shook as he measured grounds and filled the water reservoir. I watched him struggle with simple tasks, recognizing the same overwhelmed expression he'd worn as a teenager when the weight of his diagnosis had first hit him. 15 years, he said finally, not looking at me. 15 years I've been grateful to some anonymous stranger, writing letters to the bone marrow registry that I hoped would somehow reach my donor. And it was you the whole time. The pain in his voice cut through me. James, do you have any idea what that feels like? He turned to face me, and I saw tears tracking down his cheeks, to find out that the person you owe everything to has been living in your house, being treated like. He couldn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. Like a burden, like an inconvenience, like someone whose contributions didn't matter. I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything, I said softly. That's exactly why I kept it secret. You were 17, James. You were fighting for your life. The last thing you needed was the additional weight of feeling indebted to your mother. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence between us. James leaned against the counter, his head in his hands. But I am indebted to you, he said. Everything I have, everything I've accomplished, my marriage, my career, the life I've built, none of it would exist without what you did. No, I said firmly, standing to face him. Your life exists because you fought for it, because you endured months of chemotherapy and never gave up hope, because you chose to live. I just made sure you had the tools to fight. He looked up at me, his eyes red with unshed tears. You nearly died, didn't you? Sarah said there were complications, that you were in intensive care. I thought about lying, about minimizing what had happened, but we were past the time for protecting him from difficult truths. There were some challenges during the surgery, I admitted, but I recovered. And more importantly, you recovered. Mom, the word came out broken, weighted with 15 years of unexpressed gratitude. I don't know how to. I can't even begin to. You don't need to do anything, I said, reaching for his hand. You already did everything I could have hoped for. You lived, James. You became the man your father and I dreamed you'd become. That's enough. That's everything. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted us. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway, her makeup smeared and her perfect hair disheveled. She'd changed into jeans and an old sweater, as if her cocktail dress had been too much pretense to maintain. We need to talk, she said, her voice flat and carefully controlled. James straightened, instinctively moving slightly closer to me. Victoria, maybe this isn't the best time. No, we need to talk now, she interrupted, her eyes fixed on me. Before I lose my nerve, she pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. For a long moment she just stared at the table, gathering courage or composure or both. I called you a parasite, she said finally, the words barely above a whisper. Victoria, James started, but she held up a hand to stop him. I need to say this, she continued, still not looking at either of us. I called you a parasite. I said you were dramatic and selfish. I told my friends that you made everything about yourself, that you enjoyed being a martyr. The words hung in the air like accusations, each one as sharp as when I'd first heard them. But coming from Victoria herself, they sounded different, smaller, more pathetic. And the whole time, she continued, her voice beginning to crack, the whole time, you were the reason I had a husband to complain about. You saved his life, and I treated you like you were nothing. Tears were flowing freely down her face now, and for the first time since I'd known her, Victoria looked genuinely vulnerable. Not the calculated vulnerability she sometimes displayed to get her way, but the raw, ugly vulnerability of someone confronting their own cruelty. How do you live with yourself after something like that? She asked, finally looking up at me. How do you look at someone you've wronged so completely and find a way to make it right? I studied her face, searching for signs of manipulation or performance, but what I saw was genuine anguish. The kind of pain that comes from realizing you've become someone you don't recognize. You start by stopping, I said quietly. You stop treating people as if their worth depends on what they can do for you. You stop assuming that quiet people don't have important stories. You stop dismissing sacrifices just because they were made silently. Victoria nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand in a gesture that was startlingly childlike. I've been so jealous of you, she admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush, of the way James talks about you. The way his whole face changes when he mentions something you did when he was growing up. I felt like I was competing with this perfect mother figure, and I wanted to diminish that. I wanted to make him see you as ordinary, as flawed. James moved to sit beside her, his face a mixture of disappointment and compassion. "Victoria, you never had to compete with my mother. My love for her doesn't diminish my love for you." "But it should," she said bitterly. "After what I've done, after how I've treated her, it should." I found myself in the unexpected position of comforting the woman who tormented me for years. "Victoria," I said gently, "people make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. The question is what you do after you realize you've been wrong." She looked at me with something like wonder, as if she couldn't believe I was offering her grace after everything she'd put me through. "What I did to you," she said slowly, "calling you names, trying to push you out of James's life, making you feel unwelcome in your own son's home. None of that was about you. It was about my own insecurities, my own fears that I wasn't enough." "I know," I said, and realized with surprise that I meant it. Victoria's cruelty had never really been about me. It had been about her need to feel superior, to establish her place in the family hierarchy by diminishing mine. "I want to make this right," she continued. "I don't know how, but I want to try." James reached for her hand. "We'll figure it out together. All of us." But Victoria shook her head. "No, this is something I need to do myself. Something I should have done years ago." She stood up abruptly and left the room. James and I could hear her moving around upstairs, drawers opening and closing, her voice on the phone speaking in rapid, urgent tones. "What do you think she's doing?" James asked. Before I could answer, Victoria was back, carrying a large gift bag that I recognized as one she'd received at a recent birthday party. "This isn't enough," she said, setting the bag on the table in front of me. "It will never be enough, but it's a start." I opened the bag cautiously, unsure what to expect. Inside was a key, a simple brass house key attached to a keychain that read, "Home." "It's your house key," Victoria said unnecessarily. "I had the locks changed 6 months ago when we had that break-in scare, remember? I never gave you a new key because—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Because she'd wanted me to feel like a guest in my own son's home. Because she'd wanted me to have to ask permission to come and go. Because she'd been systematically trying to erase my place in the family." "And I called my yoga instructor," she continued in a rush. "The woman who made that comment about you keeping James alive? Her name is Patricia, and she used to be a nurse at St. Mary's. She remembered you from the oncology floor, remembered how devoted you were to James. She'd been wanting to say something to me for months about the way I talked about you, but she never knew how to bring it up. So the mystery was solved. Patricia, the woman who'd planted the seed that led to this moment, had been one of the nurses who'd watched me keep vigil all those years ago. She's the one who suggested I invite her to book club that night," Victoria continued. "She wanted to meet you again, to see how you were doing. When she heard me talking about you the way I did," Victoria's voice broke. She was horrified. She said she'd never heard anyone speak so cruelly about someone who'd sacrificed so much. James was staring at his wife with an expression I couldn't quite read, part admiration for her honesty, part disappointment that it had taken this long for her to see the truth. "There's something else," Victoria said, pulling out her phone. "I called everyone who was there that night. My book club, the yoga friends, everyone who heard me say those awful things about you. I told them the truth. I told them what you really did for James, and I told them that I'd been wrong about everything." She showed me her phone, and I could see a long thread of text messages, apologizing to each person individually, and setting the record straight about my role in James's recovery. "I know it doesn't fix what I said," she continued, "and it doesn't undo the damage I've done to your reputation or your feelings. But I needed them to know that when they think about Margaret Henderson, they should think about a woman who saved her son's life, not the awful things I said about you." The gesture was more than I'd expected, more than I'd dared hope for. Victoria was systematically undoing years of damage, not because she had to, but because she'd finally understood what she'd done. "Thank you," I said simply, because sometimes the simplest words carry the most weight. Victoria nodded, wiping her eyes. "I have one more thing to ask you, and I'll understand if you say no." I waited. "I want to move out," she said, looking between James and me. "Not permanently, not as a separation, but I think I need to step back and let you two rebuild your relationship without me getting in the way. I've done enough damage." James started to protest, but Victoria held up her hand. "I've been thinking about this since we left the hospital," she said. "I've spent years trying to diminish your place in James's life, and I think the best thing I can do now is give you space to reclaim it. My sister has a guest room. I could stay there for a month or two, give you both time to figure out what your relationship looks like when it's not filtered through my insecurities." It was a generous offer, one that showed real understanding of what needed to happen next. But as I looked at James's face, I realized something important. Victoria, I said slowly, I don't want you to leave. Both of them looked at me in surprise. What you did was wrong, I continued, but running away isn't going to fix it. We're family, all of us, and families work through their problems together, not by avoiding each other. Victoria's eyes filled with fresh tears. But how can you forgive me? How can you even stand to look at me after what I did? I thought about the question seriously, because she deserved an honest answer. Because 15 years ago, I learned something about love that I'd never understood before, I said finally. When you love someone enough to give them life itself, you also love them enough to forgive the people they choose to love. James chose you, Victoria. That means you're part of me too, whether you like it or not. The three of us sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling around us like dust after a storm. So what happens now? James asked quietly. I picked up the house key Victoria had given me, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. Now, I said, we start over. All of us. And this time, we do it with the truth. 6 months later, I stood in the same kitchen where this journey had begun, but everything had changed. The morning light streamed through windows that Victoria had actually asked my opinion about before replacing, and the coffee I was making was in a new machine that James had bought specifically because he'd noticed I struggled with the old one's complicated settings. Small changes, but they represented something larger, a shift in how I was seen and valued in this house that had always been my home, but hadn't felt like it in years. Morning, Mom. James appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work, but moving with the unhurried pace of someone who'd learned to prioritize what mattered. Sleep well? Like a baby, I said, and meant it. The guest room had been transformed back into what it was always supposed to be, a comfortable space for visiting, not a permanent exile. My bedroom was upstairs now, in the room that had originally been Richard's study, overlooking the garden we'd planted together 30 years ago. Victoria had insisted on the move, had spent weeks preparing the space with touching attention to detail. She'd hung photos of Richard and me throughout our marriage, had brought up my favorite reading chair from the basement, had even tracked down a replica of the bedspread I'd loved in our old room, but had given up when they'd needed the master bedroom. Victoria's already left for her appointment? I asked, noting the absence of her usual morning bustle. James nodded, pouring himself coffee from the pot I'd made. Dr. Brennan, remember? She's really committed to this therapy thing. Victoria had started seeing a counselor 2 weeks after the revelation at the hospital. Not because James or I had demanded it, but because she'd recognized something ugly in herself that night and had decided to do something about it. She told me last night that she's planning to talk about her mother today, James continued, settling into the chair across from me at the kitchen table that had become our informal meeting place for processing this new reality. Victoria's mother had been a critical woman who'd raised her daughter to believe that love was conditional on performance, that affection had to be earned through constant competition with others. Understanding the source of Victoria's insecurities hadn't excused her behavior, but it had helped explain how she'd become someone who needed to diminish others to feel secure. How do you feel about that? I asked gently. James had been on his own journey of understanding, trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the woman who'd treated his mother so cruelly. Relieved, I think, he said slowly. She's been carrying around so much anger for so long, not just at you, but at everyone who made her feel less than enough. I hope talking about it helps her find some peace. The James sitting across from me was different from the man I'd lived with for the past few years. More present, more intentional about his relationships. The revelation about my sacrifice had awakened something in him, not guilt, as I'd feared, but a deeper appreciation for the love that had always surrounded him. I've been thinking about the memorial garden, he said, changing the subject to something we'd been discussing for weeks. The memorial garden was Victoria's idea, surprisingly. She'd suggested creating a space in the backyard to honor not just Richard's memory, but also the journey our family had taken through James's illness and recovery. A place where the sacrifices made and battles won could be acknowledged and celebrated. Have you decided on the inscription? I asked. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote something last night. I wanted to run it by you before we have it carved. I unfolded the paper and read his careful handwriting. In memory of Richard Henderson, beloved husband and father, who taught us that love means never giving up on each other. In gratitude for the gift of life, given freely and received with humility. In celebration of second chances, hard-won wisdom, and the courage to see each other clearly. This garden grows in the soil of sacrifice, watered by forgiveness, and blooming with the promise that love endures. Tears blurred my vision as I read the words again. It captured everything. Richard's legacy, my sacrifice, Victoria's growth, James's gratitude, and the family we were becoming. It's perfect, I whispered. The sound of the front door opening interrupted us, followed by Victoria's voice calling out, "I'm back!" She appeared in the kitchen doorway looking lighter somehow, as she often did after her therapy sessions. The work wasn't easy, confronting decades of learned behavior never was, but she approached it with the same determination she'd once applied to dismissing me. "How did it go?" James asked, standing to embrace his wife. "Hard but good," Victoria said, accepting his hug before turning to me. "Dr. Brennan thinks I'm ready to start the next phase of my work." "Which is?" I asked. Victoria sat down at the table, her hands clasped in front of her in the gesture I'd learned meant she was about to say something important. "Making amends beyond just our family," she said. "She wants me to think about other people I might have hurt with this pattern of behavior, other times when I might have diminished someone to make myself feel better." It was a sobering thought. If Victoria had treated me so cruelly, how many others had suffered under her need to establish dominance? "That sounds challenging," I said carefully. "Terrifying," Victoria corrected with a wry smile. "But necessary. I can't become the person I want to be without acknowledging all the ways I've been the person I don't want to be." She pulled out her phone and showed me a list she'd been making. Names of people, her former assistant, a neighbor who'd tried to be friendly, women from various committees and social groups who'd attempted to include her in meaningful conversations. "I'm starting with Jennifer, my old book club leader," Victoria said. "Remember her? The one who always suggested we read books about different cultures or social issues? I used to roll my eyes and make comments about virtue signaling, but she was just trying to expand our perspectives, and I shut her down because it made me feel ignorant." The growth was remarkable to witness. 6 months ago, Victoria would never have admitted to feeling ignorant about anything. Now she was acknowledging it as the first step toward change. "I called her yesterday," Victoria continued. "Told her I was sorry for being so dismissive, and asked if she'd be willing to help me understand some of the books she'd recommended. We're having lunch next week." James beamed with pride. "That's incredible, Vic." "It's a start," she said modestly. "Dr. Brennan says the real test isn't making these initial apologies. It's maintaining the new patterns of behavior over time." She turned to me then, her expression serious. "Which brings me to something I wanted to ask you, Margaret. The use of my name still caught me off guard sometimes. For years, Victoria had simply avoided calling me anything, a subtle way of refusing to acknowledge my place in the family hierarchy. Now, she used my name with intentional respect. "What can I do for you?" I asked. "I want to know if you'd be willing to help me with something," she said. "The hospital called yesterday. They're organizing a bone marrow drive next month, and they asked if James would be willing to speak about his experience as a way to encourage people to join the registry." James nodded. I said yes, of course, but they also mentioned that donor stories are powerful too, when families are willing to share them. I began to understand where this was going. "They asked if you might be willing to speak as well," Victoria said, "to talk about what it's like to be a donor, especially a family member donor. They said stories like yours help people understand that donating isn't just about medical procedures, it's about love in action." The idea of speaking publicly about something I'd kept private for 15 years was daunting. But I thought about all the families currently facing what we'd faced, all the parents sitting in oncology waiting rooms wondering if they'd ever get their children back. "I'd be honored," I said. Victoria's face lit up with genuine joy. "Really? Really? But I have one condition." Both James and Victoria looked at me expectantly. "I want you there too, Victoria," I said. "I want you to tell your part of the story." "My part?" She looked confused. "But I wasn't even around during James's treatment." "No," I agreed. "But you're part of our story now. You're part of what it means to be a family that's learned to see each other clearly, to forgive each other's failures, and to choose love even when it's difficult." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "You want me to talk about how badly I treated you?" "I want you to talk about growth," I said gently. "About second chances. About what it looks like when someone has the courage to change." She was quiet for a long moment considering. "Okay," she said finally. "If you think it would help other families, then yes." James reached across the table to take both our hands. "Dad would be so proud of who we've become." I squeezed their fingers, feeling the truth of that statement settle into my bones. Richard would be proud, not just of James's survival and success, but of the family we'd built from the ashes of old hurts and misunderstandings. "There's something else," I said, because this moment felt right for sharing the news I'd been keeping to myself. "Dr. Rodriguez called me yesterday." Both of them looked concerned. "Nothing bad," I assured them quickly. He wanted to tell me that the Bone Marrow Registry has established a new program. They're calling it the Henderson Initiative. The Henderson Initiative? James echoed. It's designed to support families through the donation process, especially when there are complications or extended recovery periods, I explained. Dr. Rodriguez recommended the program be named after our family because he said our story exemplifies both the challenges and the ultimate rewards of family donation. Victoria gasped. They're naming a program after us? After what we went through together, I said. After what we learned about love and sacrifice and forgiveness, the three of us sat in comfortable silence, absorbing the magnitude of it. Our story, our painful, complicated, ultimately redemptive story, would help other families navigate their own journeys through serious illness and family crisis. I love you both, James said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. I know I don't say it enough, but I do. I love you, Mom, for everything you've given me. And I love you, Victoria, for having the courage to change and grow. I love you too, Victoria said, looking at both of us, both of you. And I'm grateful every day that I get to be part of this family, even though I didn't always act like it. I stood up from the table and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where Richard's memorial would soon stand. In a few hours, the landscapers would arrive to begin planting the flowers Victoria had selected. Roses and lilies and hardy perennials that would bloom year after year. A living testament to enduring love. You know what I keep thinking about? I said, turning back to face them. What? James asked. That night when I overheard Victoria talking to her friends, when someone said I was the one who kept you alive. I thought my secret was about to be exposed and I was terrified. And now? Victoria asked softly. Now I realize that secrets kept to protect people you love aren't burdens. They're gifts. And when the time is right, when the truth can heal instead of harm, those gifts can be shared. I moved back to the table and placed my hands on their shoulders. We're going to help other families find their way through the darkness, I said. We're going to share our story so that other mothers know they're not alone in their vigil. Other donors understand that recovery takes time, and other families learn that love can survive even the worst misunderstandings. Victoria reached up to cover my hand with hers. The Henderson Initiative, James agreed. As we sat together in the kitchen where my heartbreak had begun just 6 months ago, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace. Not the peace of resignation or acceptance, but the peace that comes from being exactly where you belong, with people who see you clearly and love you fully. Outside, the spring morning was giving way to afternoon, and the garden was ready for new growth. Inside, 3 imperfect people who'd learned to forgive each other were planning to spend their lives helping others do the same. Richard would indeed be proud. But more than that, he would be at peace, knowing that the family he'd loved was finally, truly whole.